All right, this is your Chapter 4 set of notes. We're going to talk about population ecology. It's pretty logical. Please listen to the end. There are things that I'm going to talk about that you don't necessarily need to know for the test, but I think you should know as a biology student and a human. So you need to know everything that's highlighted. This will be pretty quick, so here we go. Before we can talk about populations, you do need to understand a few things about how they're measured. Most importantly, what is a population, which you should know. So we're going to count the number of organisms of one species in a certain area at a certain time. So populations fluctuate all the time. When we talk about a population, if there's a lot of an organism, we can also say that population is dense. So I think that's logical. Dense things have lots of matter per volume, so lots of organisms per space means the same thing. Populations always fluctuate, and that is healthy. So I will talk a little bit about that, and we'll look at some graphs, which is important. We'll talk about what causes those populations to fluctuate. Both biotic and abiotic factors can have different effects on a population. You'll need to understand that. And right along those lines, some populations die off because they're overpopulated. Some populations die off because of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or just basically bad luck. So those are our goals for this unit. So let's learn this. The most important thing you need to understand is carrying capacity. So this definition, please write it down. It's the max of a species that can be supported in a certain area for an indefinite length of time. So populations always fluctuate, but if you look at an average of that fluctuation, then you come up with what is known as a carrying capacity. So this is a graph of a population showing a carrying capacity. Please draw this in your notes and label all these parts. So population is the y-axis, and we're going over time. So we're counting how many of this organism is there each year, and you'll notice that there's an overshoot, and this would be normal. So if this was a bunch of squirrels, okay, so maybe there's lots and lots of food, so the squirrels have lots of babies, all of a sudden they've reached a point where there's not enough food for all the babies that they had, so then the population starts to die off. It can die off because they get overcrowded and disease starts to spread, or they simply run out of resources, so food, water, and space. Now all of a sudden they're down here and the environment has lots of food again, so now they can increase their population. And this normal fluctuation is healthy. The orange line on here is what we added to the graph to show that average carrying capacity through that fluctuation. So this is how really any organism in our environment will fluctuate. So depending on the type of organism, for example, if we're talking about a fly or a cockroach, we'll see these fluctuations within their growing season, like the summer, and then you'll notice in the winter, those little weather-dependent organisms will hugely die off, but then when they're in their growing time, they will do this normal fluctuation. So we're not going to worry a whole lot about that, but you need to know what an overshoot is, and you need to know that that carrying capacity is that average line through that normal healthy fluctuation. All right, so what makes that carrying capacity happen? Obviously, if you have fewer or a lower birth rate or increasing death rates, you can change your population. So fewer babies will be born, or more of an organism will die when the food runs out, when the space gets a little crowded, because that makes organisms either move in or move out, or it will make disease spread. So again, I think this is logical if you think about what we need to survive and what happens when we get crowded. Also, predator-prey relationships will cause that carrying capacity to find its little niche. And most importantly, notice that all of the things that create a carrying capacity are biotic factors. They are talking about relationships between organisms or other living things, and that is all related to being crowded. So again, if we look back at this graph, there are lots of resources, lots of space, lots of babies being born. Now we run out of space, so maybe some of these organisms moved away. More than likely, though, you ran out of food or water or disease spread, and there's a die-off. Now there's lots of space, lots of food, so we're going to have more babies. So it's all biotic factors that create that healthy carrying capacity line. Here's another example of what creates a carrying capacity, a predator-prey relationship. So the blue line here are rabbits, the red line are wolves. So the bunnies have lots of food and space, so they're going to have lots and lots of babies. When there's lots of bunnies around, then the wolf population can increase because they have lots of food. Now all of a sudden the bunnies get crowded, they're going to run out of food and water, or maybe disease will spread, or maybe they're tired of getting eaten by wolves, so they move away. Either way, their population goes down. Right after that, the wolf population goes down. This green and pink line going through each curve would show you what the carrying capacity for that environment is. So all of this is just environmental studies so that you can understand the world around you and maybe what's healthy for that world around you. All right, sometimes we have huge diebacks. And what could make that huge dieback? And I forgot to hide these answers, but weather. So let's say that this is a graph of the population of our school building. And at noon, there are lots of people in the building, and all of a sudden a tornado hits, and we all die off. So sometimes you can have huge diebacks that have nothing to do with a healthy curve. So this blue line is showing the healthy curve, but you have whatever happens with this overshoot, but then something terrible happens like weather. Invasive species can do the same thing. So we'll come back to invasive species, but I want you to know the difference between a density independent factor and a density dependent factor. Density independent, so it doesn't matter how many organisms are there, are things like weather. So if there's one person in the school or 2,000 people in the school, if a tornado hits the school, everybody in the school is dead. So it doesn't matter how many people are here, you're dead whether there's one or you're dead whether there's a bunch. So again, usually that is weather events. Humans also do this to organisms. We move in and we disrupt their environment, and all of a sudden there's a huge die-off or an extinction. So humans are also just as evil as an abiotic factor that will kill off a population despite what's healthy. Density dependent factors are things like this. These all change because of how many of an organism are out there. Okay, invasive species, you need to know the definition. They are species that are not native, meaning they aren't supposed to be there. Because they aren't supposed to be there, an invasive species won't have a predator, and usually people are the ones that bring in these invasive species. So zebra mussels are a really commonly known, infamous invasive species, and they move to new lakes not because they can crawl over there, they're just a little clammy thing, but because people bring them over in their boats. And once that zebra mussel gets into a new environment, it doesn't have a predator. So it can just eat and eat and eat. And because nothing is there eating that zebra mussel, it will thrive. So you should be able to interpret a graph like this. You might want to pause and draw this. This is showing the red and blue line is a predator-prey relationship. So this red squirrel is supposed to be there. And then all of a sudden this invasive species, a gray squirrel, moved in. And this is real. If you look around in our world, we only have gray squirrels because they outcompeted what should have been here, which was a red squirrel. So a long time ago, there were red squirrels running around. Gray squirrels came over and they started thriving because nobody wants to eat a gray squirrel. So the red squirrels ran out of food because they were dying. Their predator also died off. So an invasive species destroyed that ecosystem because it ruined that whole part of the food chain, which, as we know, probably affected more of the food web and then the whole ecosystem. All right, let's look at some human populations. I'm going to skip over this, but I want you to understand humans do not follow normal biological studies because of these things. Because we are so smart, we have changed our environment. We have learned how to get along and work together, which is actually super important for our success as a species. We learned how to plant big crops, and we learned how to save those crops with refrigeration. and we learned how to save ourselves with medicine. So I'm going to pause for a second. This is a population clock. So you can see the world population increasing. So this is taking into account births and deaths, and you can see how our population is changing. So this right now it says we're a little over 7.5 billion and updated on September 1st. So pretty accurate. I'm making this on September 2nd. Graph of human population. So here's our agricultural revolution started around here, but once we got industry and then eventually antibiotics, we have exploded. Here's another graph of human population. This is kind of old, but this graph is predicting that we will hit a carrying capacity at about 10 billion. Other numbers I've seen since then is our world can support 16 billion humans. So it all depends on how we're doing with agriculture and medicine and industry. This is another super interesting graph. So if you look at what these lines show, this is, and this was in 2015. So again, it's a little bit old, but we're right up here, a little over 7.5 billion right now. So right where it predicted us to be, population's right where my arrow is. If we keep growing at this rate, it will get up here. But look at what people are doing. We're learning that our population is affecting our quality of life. So in the 1960s, our population increase was 2.1%. Now we're increasing at 0.1% every year. And that's what they're predicting to make this level off. So I apologize. This is a prediction for in another 80 years, but the curve is going down. So we are learning from all these environmental studies that we need to slow down our population growth because humans will hit a carrying capacity on our planet, and we don't want a big bust. I think it's important to think about right now the coronavirus because it's following this curve, okay, wherever it went, way back here. We had a, well, I'm not going to try to find it, sorry, but we are booming, lots and lots of people, and there is a, so right here, bubonic plague, you can see, bubonic plague hit and population went way down right here. Same thing is kind of happening with COVID. Our population is up. Because we are crowded, we are spreading this disease rapidly, and we are experiencing a die-off that shouldn't normally happen. So it could be worse. I don't think it's as bad as scientists were predicting, but we are in a little niche like this where our population is going down because of a virus. One last thing, actually two last things. This is another graph that shows the purple line is humans increasing, and this is the number of extinctions every year. So we are kind of like an invasive species where we come in and alter the environment and disrupt an ecosystem and cause huge die-offs. So this green line shows the number of species becoming extinct every year, and it matches the human population. So this graph would show that humans are the cause of mass extinctions. There are other graphs, but this one shows that point. This graph also makes a point that as human population increases, we're also seeing an increase in carbon emissions. So again, take this for what the graph is showing you, which is simply this correlation. There are obviously other things involved, but if you were to just look at this graph, you would say, oh, the more humans there are, the more carbon we emit into our environment. Therefore, humans are the cause of carbon-induced climate change, which we will talk about in our next unit. But good to be able to read graphs. That is it for now.